Last week I spent some time with some incredible, faithful Christians. And as we were walking down the street in New Orleans, a very dark street, in a little bit of the evening chill, we came across a couple, two people, who turned out to be mother and son, mother in wheelchair, son wheeling her along, a little bit of the smell of alcohol on someone's breath, the smell of probably not having had a chance for a shower in quite some time, and our group of clergy, faithful Christians we were, saw them and acknowledged them, and then kept on walking to dinner. Except for one of our colleagues who stopped. Not me. I was ready for dinner. I wasn't ready for the conversation and however long this was going to go. I just wasn't in the mood to respond to somebody else's need at that time. And as my colleague stopped and wound up spending about 20 minutes with them, listening to their story, missing the appetizers, he walked them to the trolley where they were hoping to be able to spend the night going back and forth down the streetcar, because the shelters had all sold out for the night. And after buying them a meal and putting them on the trolley, he decided to join us, just a tad bit disgusted in his colleagues. And we, the colleagues, while sitting there, had realized the irony of the story, felt a whole lot like that story of the Good Samaritan, or any of the number of stories where there are all these other disciples and so-called followers of Jesus who ignore people in need who are near them. And then we started to talk about what seems to be increasingly true. Now, this was a dark street, and I tend not to talk to strangers on a dark street. Our colleague who stopped is 6'7", big man, a little bit more in a position to do things, but still, we can come up with excuses, right? But so often we have them. And as we were sitting there doing our little Bible study on why we failed to show up for this family in their time of need, we realized that when we don't feel safe, we are much less likely to be able to find ways to respond to people with compassion. And there are studies about this. That if our bodies, or even, let's say, our homes or our livelihoods might be compromised by the act of compassion, then we're much less likely to do it. And when you sit down with people and ask them to whom are they willing to extend themselves, you'll see a stark difference in what they're willing to do based on how safe they feel. But if you give them, and this is what the studies found, if you give them just a moment to just meditate or guide their meditations and still their hearts just a little bit, if you give them a chance to build trust for a moment, either trust for the person or trust for the space they're in, then you ask the questions again about who they're willing to extend themselves to, and everything transforms. And if the person asking another to give something up and take a personal risk, these studies have found, if that person can figure out how to build trust with those folks, then they're much more willing to look across the aisle or set prejudices aside. And then that person being asked to try to give something up will say, maybe I can do it. And in our conversation as colleagues, we talked about how the ones who need support needed to find ways to build that trust with the ones who had power to do something about it. If only, they started to say, we could have a moment to establish relationships and help others to see our humanity. If only we could have the chance to show that we were worth the risk. If only then we could prepare them to see us as human, as worthy. Which got us thinking, is it up to someone else to demonstrate their worthiness as a human being? Or is the onus on the other to show others why we should love them? Or is it on us to know how to see it immediately, universally. And if somebody else is created in the image of God, which we affirm here consistently, right? Every human is created in the image of God. Then how can we be equipped to know that from jump, from the start? But let me put this a different way. We always have to read ourselves into the stories of the Bible, right? And as Jesus walked the earth, there were people who saw him and recognized him and followed him and protected him and loved him and cared for him and fed him and clothed him. He did not come with any of those things on his own. And so when we read the stories about Jesus' times, each of us, I would think, would hope to be counted in that number. If we had been alive then, we would have been one of those people, as the ones who would see Jesus as he was. But the trick here is that we have to realize that even in Jesus' time, it was pretty unusual to recognize him for who he was. And very few people did. Some did. Many did, but most people didn't. And if that's true, then that's probably the case for us too. Very few of us would be prepared to recognize Jesus and respond to him without some pretty radical transformation. Because we're trained to be suspicious. We're conditioned to protect our own at any cost. We're accustomed to looking out for number one because, quite frankly, we've had to. Or we feel that we have to give up everything in consideration of our family structures. We know some of those people who sacrifice everything for family. And then there's no room left for anyone else, including themselves. And if we do everything we can to elevate, say, our children, even if that means completely ignoring what we ourselves need, then we don't even have a sense of what it's like to be loved anymore. And then how is there room to love Jesus? But here's the thing. We are called upon to be ready to love. Ready to love our neighbor, of course. But we can't pull that off if we don't love ourselves too. And we certainly can't do it if we haven't committed ourselves to loving God along with it. It's always those three, and that is not easy. And finding that balance or reorienting ourselves within that balance is what it means to be ready for Jesus. And if you want to be ready for Jesus, then you need to be ready for Jesus however he might show up. And if it would mean as someone who's virtually homeless as he was last time around, then we might want to get used to being in conversation, in loving conversation with people who looked and lived like Jesus did. I absolutely adore our stained glass windows. Turn around, can you see them? I don't know how much you get to see them. Aren't they beautiful? Can you see them from where you're sitting? There's a way to get fooled by stained glass windows about who Jesus was, because they usually depict a really profound moment. I'm not exactly sure what that is. It's like it's transfiguration or one of these big holy moments, maybe ascension, but more likely transfiguration. He's there surrounded with an angel. And the thing is that for a moment where it was really, really clear who Jesus was, where he gets elevated into the skies, very few people got to see that. Very, very few. Most people just saw him dirty on the street. And the encounters that folks actually had a chance to have with Jesus were much less desirable. Not at an invite-only VIP reception where an artist from Tiffany was invited to come and depict the scene and capture the moment. And actually, for the most part, the encounters with Jesus weren't even in a space like this. We hear about him going into the synagogue or into the temple, and those were pretty tough moments. But here's my hope. Within the walls of the sanctuary, people got ready. They got their grounding. And that was where they figured out how to recognize the signs and how to orient their ethics, how to position themselves to the kind of love that stretched them past their capacities. And faith, this is what faith is about. It's about figuring out how to extend beyond what we know to be certain and to find something beautiful there and know that we will. Do you want to be ready? Because being ready means that we have to stretch. And we can't stay where we are because with our regular habits taking the lead, we will certainly miss Jesus. This is clear. Now, growing up, it was our practice to take a trip to the Kennedy Center every year, especially for two events. One was to see the Dance Theater of Harlem, and the other was to see Alvin Ailey every single year. And our bodies needed that rhythm. For Dance Theater of Harlem, I was only interested in going if they were going to do the Firebird, which ends with this beautiful ascension of the bird who had been so beleaguered. But for Ailey, I had to see Revelations. Didn't want to go if they weren't going to do it. Do you know the piece? You saw a moment of it. In 1960, so just imagine that context. In 1960, Alvin Ailey choreographed and conceived this work, and it begins with the spiritual, "I've been buked," proclaiming the rejection and the humiliation of experience that by faith led to the profession that I ain't gonna lay my religion down, even if we've been buked. And then it asks the question, didn't my Lord deliver Daniel? And why not every person, man, the piece goes. After which the piece moves into a sigh saying, oh, fix me, Jesus, fix me. Fix me for my journey home. But the pinnacle, I believe, comes at the quintessential Advent song. Because remember, in Advent, as we prepare, it's a season for that. And it's the time when we prepare for whatever it is the Lord has in store for us. And there, the piece says, I want to be ready. I want to be ready. I want to be ready. I want to be ready, Lord, ready to put on my long white robe. Are you? Are we ready? Are you ready for your robe? Do you even know where it is? You may be concerned about things like Christmas decorations, how you'll figure out the perfect present, how you'll maybe even afford the one present you can't figure out how to skip. But in Advent, none of that really matters. It might to somebody else, but it doesn't matter to God. Because this season is about our readiness for what God needs and requires specifically from us. And as we wonder about that readiness, I return back to the piece. And notice what Alvin Ailey does in this choreography. They want to be ready. And the only thing that matters when the Ailey dancers do Revelations, every time they offer this prophetic witness of Ailey's choreography, is that sense of groundedness. Do you see how he keeps coming back to the ground? And you see the work, and you will watch a dancer whose core has to be so strong, who knows the ground he stands on and understands it with humility. He only gets up after a struggle to be known. And as he finally finds his feet, the way he stays standing is by stretching, grasping at the heavens and taking strength from them. Embracing the boldness of reaching up high and knowing the power of deliverance, all while being rooted in the ground, in the past, in the ancestry, in the stories, in the land. In other words, what we see is that Alvin Ailey wants to teach us how to reach up to heaven, to know the ground we stand on, to know the blood in which it has been soaked, the blood of the ancestors, the blood of the indigenous, the blood of the enslaved, the blood of the HIV positive, the blood of Jesus. And then from there, we're called to wade. But not too long, because God troubles the waters and lifts us from them. Grounded from the soil from which we come, we wade, but we do not linger. And that's how we get ready for our robe. We reach high to receive it. But who can endure the day of his coming? And who can stand when he appears? We have to have the core and the endurance and the preparation for the race, which means that we will run. But because it's God's race, we won't be weary. We can be ready to run, to reach, and God will hand everything we need to us, including the keys to the kingdom in that reach of salvation. But to be ready to grasp those keys, we have to know that we're not going to be the only ones to hold them. And we can't reach for the keys with the gleeful joy that our enemies won't be able to do the same. And we can't reach for the keys with the assurance of our safety even against enemies. But instead, we have to be prepared to see God even anywhere, even encamped with our enemies, especially in the place or amongst the people we fear the most. And writing our whole lives around those assumptions, that's what it means to be ready, to be humble, and to trust in God. Because we have to be ready to go where God will take us, even and especially if it's the last place we want to go. So as we call on this time of preparation, we have to ask, are we ready to be ready? I want and I need to be ready. As the day has passed and gone and evening shades appear, we want to be ready so that we know our redemption. And are you ready for the joy of being rocked in the bosom of Abraham? As Judith Jamison, Ailey's muse, reflected on her understanding of his choreography, she said something like, he always wanted you to see your place in the dance. Not that you and I have to be able to do what the dancers do on stage, but you could see, yes, these spirituals and the movement connected to them are the dance of my life. The struggle to get off the ground and yet to stay connected to it is the dance of our lives. So dance. See the trouble all over this world and know that your faith, your inspiration, your calling to stretch, your ability to call on God to surpass, that sometimes daily practice, that's what's going to carry you through. Even if they rebuke you, scorn you, when you know that God's got you no matter what, the God who has you shows you born, you remember even that Lord delivered Daniel, Jonah from the belly of a whale, then why not you? That's my prayer for this Advent. Amen.